The beak is the first thing you notice, not the black robes, not the wide-brimmed hat, not the leather gloves that go all the way to the elbow. The beak, it's long, longer than you'd expect, curved downward like a crow's, but hollow, stuffed with dried herbs and flowers and vinegar-soaked sponges. The man wearing it moves through a street in 14th century Marseille, and everyone gets out of his way, not from respect, from terror, because where this figure walks, the dying are close behind, the smell coming off the street, sweet and wrong, the particular sweetness that means something biological is failing, is the reason for the beak. The herbs inside are supposed to filter it. The doctors of the time believe that disease travels in bad air, miasma they call it, poisoned atmosphere. They believe that if you can seal yourself inside leather and breathe only through purified air, you can treat the sick and survive. Here's the thing, they were wrong about the mechanism, but some of them, not all, some were right about something else entirely. And that part of the story was buried so deliberately, for so long, that it took until the 20th century for anyone to go looking. Hidden Past Revealed exists for exactly this kind of night, when sleep won't come and your mind wants something real to turn over. If you're new here, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means there's always something waiting the next time the quiet gets loud. Drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. I genuinely want to know who's awake out there. And before we go anywhere else, I need to tell you something about those plague doctors that almost nobody knows, because the beak is not the beginning of this story. It's a distraction. Most people believe the Black Death was a medieval catastrophe that the medieval world simply had no tools to understand, that the doctors of the time were helpless, superstitious, stumbling through a fog of religious dogma and folk nonsense, bleeding patients and praying and burning incense and watching everyone die anyway. That the concept of contagion, the idea that disease passes from person to person, was centuries away from serious consideration. That the church controlled all understanding of illness, and the church said plague was divine punishment, and so the doctors said the same, and in saying the same they doomed millions. That version is mostly wrong, and the correction is more disturbing than the myth. Because the truth is that by the mid-14th century, at least 40 years before the Black Death reached its peak in Europe, physicians in the Islamic world had already developed a coherent, sophisticated and largely accurate theory of contagion. A scholar and doctor named Ibn al-Khatib, working in Granada in 1362, wrote a treatise called On the Plague, in which he argued methodically and with evidence that the disease spread through clothing vessels and direct contact with the sick, that it passed from person to person through something invisible carried in their breath and touch. He noted that isolated communities with no contact with infected populations remained healthy. He noted that certain caretakers who had regular contact with plague victims got sick at higher rates than those who avoided contact. He was describing, without the vocabulary, germ theory. 600 years before it was officially discovered, Ibn al-Khatib was later accused of heresy and murdered. His murderers were not illiterate peasants. They were educated men. Here is where the story goes somewhere unexpected. The European physicians who wore the beaked masks were not, in most cases, ignorant. The image we have of them, stumbling and fumbling, relying on astrology and prayer, is partly accurate and partly a later construction, a way of distancing the Enlightenment from its medieval predecessors by making those predecessors seem maximally foolish. But the reality is more complicated and more interesting. Some plague doctors in 14th and 15th century Europe kept meticulous records. They documented patterns. They noticed, as Ibn al-Khatib noticed independently, that the disease spread through contact. Some of them wrote about it privately, in letters, in journals, in marginalia scratched into the edges of official texts. And several of them, when they tried to act on what they observed, when they recommended isolation, when they suggested quarantine, when they proposed restricting the movement of people from infected areas, they were not just ignored, they were silenced. In Florence in 1348, a physician named Gentile de Foligno had just completed a detailed written consultation about the plague, a concilium, the formal medical document of the era, when he died of the disease himself. His note survived. Historians who have studied them carefully note something striking. He describes the plague as spreading through corruption in the air, proceeding from the influence of stars and heavenly bodies, which is the official, acceptable, church-compatible explanation. But then, in the same document, in the practical recommendations, he advises against staying in close proximity to the sick, against touching their clothing, against sharing sleeping spaces. He describes the mechanism through astrological language, but his practical advice implies something else entirely. His behavior, the behavior encoded in the text, reveals a man who suspects the truth but knows he cannot say it plainly. Think about what that means. He knew, or nearly knew, and he wrapped it in language that would not get him killed. There's a word for that. We usually apply it to political dissidents. We don't usually apply it to medieval doctors. But we should, because here is the pattern that repeats throughout the Black Death and its aftermath, and it is the pattern that nobody discusses when they talk about plague doctors and their beaked masks and their theatrical strangeness. Across Europe, across nearly 2 centuries of recurring plague outbreaks, there is a consistent record of medical observation being filtered, softened, or suppressed when it conflicted with the dominant theological explanation of disease as divine punishment. The logic was airtight from the Church's perspective. If plague is God's judgment, then identifying a physical mechanism for its spread implies that God's judgment can be circumvented through human action. That implication is theologically dangerous, because if you can stop a plague by quarantine, then the plague was not divine will, it was just biology. And if it was just biology, what else was just biology? The question unfolds in directions that threaten the entire architecture of medieval authority. So the doctors who knew, the ones who observed, recorded, and began to understand, had a choice: speak plainly and risk everything, or encode the truth in acceptable language and publish the practical advice while keeping the actual reasoning private. Most chose the second. A few chose the first. And several of those who chose the first are difficult to trace in the historical record, because the record was managed by the same institutions that needed the truth to stay quiet. This is not conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. Nobody sat in a dark room and decided to suppress science. It was more organic than that, and in some ways more frightening. It was a system that produced suppression automatically, without requiring any individual villain, simply because the incentives all pointed one way and the consequences of deviation were severe and immediate. Here is the modern parallel, and it is not subtle. In December 2019, a doctor named Li Wenliang in Wuhan, China, sent a private message to a group of colleagues warning them of a new SARS-like illness spreading through the city. He was called in by local police, made to sign a statement saying he had made false comments, and ordered to stop making false comments that had severely disturbed the social order. He went back to work. He contracted the illness. He died in February 2020 at 33 years old. Within 6 months, his warning had been vindicated so completely that his name became a symbol recognized across the entire world. But he didn't get to see it. What he got was the police station and the signature and the order to be quiet. 6 centuries apart, different continent, different language, different century, same structure. The plague doctors and their beaked masks are one of the most recognizable images in all of human history. We put them on Halloween costumes. We use them as avatars and symbols of death and mystery. And in doing so, we have aestheticized something that was, underneath the drama, a story about what happens to knowledge when knowledge is inconvenient. The beak, stuffed with herbs, filtering bad air, it's a monument to a wrong theory. But the hands inside the gloves, the eyes behind the glass lenses, the mind that wrote careful notes in candlelight and then chose its words very deliberately before going to press. That is the part of the plague doctor that deserves to be remembered. And now the strange dimension, the one that takes a moment to settle. We tend to imagine that the people living through the Black Death experienced it as the end of the world. And in a sense it was. Up to 60% of Europe's population gone in some regions. Entire villages reduced to silence. Children growing up in a landscape defined by absence. But the survivors did something that doesn't fit the narrative of pure trauma. Within a generation, some of them began making art about it. Dark art, yes, the dance of death, skeletons leading kings and popes and peasants in a macabre procession, but art nonetheless. They began writing, they began questioning. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, is full of laughter, full of sex, full of people asserting that life is worth living precisely because it is finite and fragile. The plague accelerated the Renaissance. The Black Death is directly connected through the economic disruption it caused, through the labor shortages that gave surviving peasants unprecedented leverage, through the theological crisis it produced when God's punishment killed the righteous alongside the sinners, to the beginning of the modern world, which means that everything you take for granted about the society you live in, its individualism, its skepticism of authority, its eventual embrace of scientific reasoning over theological decree, has roots in a catastrophe that killed 100 million people. Your right to question, your cultural inheritance of doubt, was purchased in the 14th century by a population that had no idea what it was buying. What do you do with that? You carry it, I think. Not heavily, not with guilt, but with a specific kind of gratitude that's only possible when you understand where something came from. Every time a scientist publishes a result that challenges the prevailing consensus, every time a doctor says, "I think we've been wrong about this," in a room full of people who need the old answer to be right. That is the plague doctor in the candlelight, choosing words carefully, encoding the truth in language that might survive. The beak is gone, the robes are in museums, but the situation is older than any institution and has not resolved itself. Let your breathing find its own rhythm now. You don't have to hold anything in your mind. Let the image of the Marseille street dissolve, the cobblestones, the smell, the figure moving through the crowd. Let the candlelight in the physician's study gutter and go quiet. What remains is not fear. It's something more like solidarity. Across 7 centuries, across language and plague and silence and the controlled burning of inconvenient books, some part of human understanding kept passing itself forward. In letters, in marginalia, in the coded language of practical advice, in the stubborn insistence on watching what actually happens and writing it down. That thread held. It held. You are downstream of everyone who refused to stop looking, even when looking was dangerous. That's the inheritance. That's what tonight was about. Thank you for spending this hour with Hidden Past Revealed. If this one stayed with you, a like helps other people find their way here in the small hours when the mind needs somewhere to go. Drop a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what part of this hit you hardest. Subscribing is always open, always free, and means there's always a story waiting. Channel membership is there if you want to go deeper whenever that feels right. Now, close your eyes. Let the dark be the comfortable kind. Somewhere out there under the same vast patient sky that watched the plague pass and the Renaissance begin, and every century of hard-won understanding accumulate into the world you're sleeping in tonight, the stars are still keeping their long, indifferent, somehow comforting watch. Rest well. You've earned it.